When Joji Nagashima gave the E90 M3 some timeless body lines, the engineers over at BMW M were creating a timeless powertrain. The S65 V8 sound and feel has stood the test of time over the past 10 to 12 years, and today we're going to show you everything you need to know about maintaining the S65 V8. So why should you care about the BMW S65 V8? Well, it's honestly one of the few engines I think BMW has produced that outweighs its maintenance costs in feel and enjoyment. After all, it was created during an era where BMW was running a works F1 team. In fact, this V8 shares nothing with any other BMW V8 aside from its firing order, which it only shares with the F1 car they were running at the time. The aluminum silicon construction of the S65 block means that it actually has a bed plate design instead of just typical main caps. The aluminum silicon also means that it's incredibly light, weighing only a little bit more than its predecessor, the S54 Straight 6. At 414 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque, it's actually a really punchy unit for its weight, and even though it's a quad-cam V8, it's actually fairly compact compared to something like a 5.0 Coyote quad-cam V8. While everyone seems to think that these are the best factory headers ever and they're equal length, that's only partially true. They are the best factory headers ever, but they're actually unequal length as this is a cross-plane V8. The thought is if it's a cross-plane V8, the exhaust pulses aren't evenly spaced, so the headers are lengthened or shortened to make all the exhaust pulses meet right here at the collector. This is an entirely factory system, just polished in this case, and it's pretty badass that they did this from the factory. It also features 8 individual throttle bodies and a factory ported intake tract. This 4-liter V8 actually produces more specific output than the S85 V10 on which it's based. You can still see a few birthmarks here and there, like the casting for the electronic scavenge pump on the S85 V10, which the S65 doesn't have. The S65 does still feature a dual oil pickup system with a front sump to pull engine oil back to the rear so that the mechanical oil pump can send it up to the motor. This is awesome for performance driving, and out of the box, it's pretty much what BMW were to make if they were competing with something like a Porsche GT3. The E90 M3 came with either a 6-speed manual or a 7-speed DCT. The DCT is totally unique in that even later generations of cars, 7th gear was an overdrive. In the E90 M3, it is 1-to-1. Just like a rally car transmission or a short circuit course transmission, it has really tight ratio gears, and I think it effectively uses the S65's very peaky power band. Revving to 8,300 RPM, it also has a few cool valve train features, such as cam gears that actually interact with each other. There's only one sprocket for the timing chain, hence this little bulge here. And the bulge on the E90's hood is actually to house a beautiful factory plenum. We have one cut open here so you can see the inside. Usually this is plastic welded shut, but this is the factory set of trumpets. While it's still just black plastic, it is certainly hundreds and hundreds of hours, if not thousands of hours in development time to extract more peak output from this 4-liter V8 than BMW got with the 5-liter V10 at 414 horsepower or a little over 100 horsepower per liter. So it should be noted before I even get into this that E90 M3s and the S65 engine can actually last a very long time. There's been multiple engines that have lived well over 200,000 miles. I know BBI Autosport, one of their engineers, actually has a daily driver with I think 230,000 miles on it, and my engine right there has 161,000 miles on it. So rest assured that with a little bit of maintenance and some wherewithal, your S65 can last a pretty long time and won't break the bank doing so. Also, because it's not a turbocharged engine and everything is pretty much in the valley, it's quite easy to work on. So if this is your first car you've ever really worked on much, don't sweat it. I'll say it myself, the rod bearings were the first thing I ever did inside of an engine, aside from I think a head gasket once, and it really wasn't that bad. So with that, we're going to get into everything. We'll start with the more basic everyday items. We'll move into a little bit more costly repairs, and then finally we'll get onto the thing everyone talks about, the rod bearings, and the thing everyone probably should talk about, the main bearings. The S65 has a pretty unique oiling system. So the engine actually features 2 oil sumps, and what that means is there is an auxiliary scavenge pump which moves oil from the front of the engine, which is why there's a small front sump, back to the rear for the main engine pump or main oil pump to move it around the engine. This is a distinction because you basically have to drain the oil from two different places when you're doing an oil change. There's a cutout in the under tray for this, but just remember to use both drain holes. If you don't, you'll have an extra liter or so of oil left in the motor when you go to fill it back up, and you don't want that hitting your crank counterweights or foaming up in your engine. The S65 uses an also sort of unique engine type in that it's 1060, which might sound very thick. That is because the valve train and the top end of the S65 with its cam gears is actually very, very noisy. And BMW, I'm sure, had a bunch of people probably being like, why does my luxury sports car make a bunch of sewing machine noises? So they prescribed 1060 for the S65. You could run a thinner oil if you'd like, but 1060 is what we sell for it here at FCPRO. On the topic of fluids, with the aluminum silicon construction of the S65, basically everything attached to it is also aluminum. You're going to want to use blue coolant, whether it's something like Xerox G48 with a 50-50 water mix or BMW genuine coolant. You just want to make sure that you're not introducing any sort of corrosion to the aluminum block, because if you use the wrong coolant, you could form an electrolyte and cause corrosion. So just be sure that your coolant is blue. I personally just use a mixture of G48 or BMW genuine, and it works awesome. Speaking of subtle differences, the S65 is one of the only engines I've personally ever heard of that had a belt routing change through its production cycle. So May of 2008, May 15th, BMW went, no, the belt must go the other way, and moved it from routing above the power steering pulley to below. Also changed the sizes of a couple of the pulleys and tensioners on the front of the motor. The biggest change and the easiest way to tell the difference is that one of them, the later one, has a double-sided belt. It actually has ribs, V-grooves on both sides, whereas the early production is just a standard belt and goes on normally. So pay attention to that when you're servicing your S65, and if you use the FCPRO garage tool, then that'll take care of that. Just be wary if your car is a 2008 production to check the production date, and if it's after or before 5/15 of 2008, you will have to choose your belt accordingly. Another subtle nuance that happened was the air filters. In September of 2009, some other German engineer went, no, the air filter will fall out, but curiously only for the US market. Globally, the E92 M3 or E9X M3 received this one with a longer stub, which clips into the airbox, spring-loaded little nipple inside of it. But in the United States, before September of 2009, we received this air filter. This is a performance air filter, but same concept with a shorter nub. So if you have a pre-09 of 2009 car, then you are going to have to either convert your airbox to the later style, which unfortunately is very expensive if you want an original part, or you could source one from a junkyard, which I've done with my own engine, so I'd recommend that option. Since the S65 is solely featured in the E9X M3, it's actually one of the only M3s ever to feature a totally bespoke powertrain. We have to talk about the stuff that's attached to the E9X itself. This expansion tank is unfortunately part of the lineage of BMW failure-prone expansion tanks. If you open up your engine or you're taking a look at a used E9X M3 and you notice that there's little white streaks on this expansion tank underneath this seam here, that means it's going to need an expansion tank replacement. Thankfully, these are very easy to swap out. They just have quick disconnect connectors and they're not very expensive. But just be aware of that before it explodes like mine did on my car last year. Speaking of being in the engine bay, FCPRO also carries a whole host of upgrades you can do for both aesthetics, feel, and sound for your E9X M3. The S65 is an absolutely incredible engine. It's borderline a motorsport part. However, turning that up to 11 a little bit from the factory can yield some pretty amazing results. So upgrades such as the E-Venturi carbon fiber plenum means you're going to hear that induction noise off the back side of your intake valves. Also, things like the front inlet tube can pick up a few horsepower by getting rid of that big, not so good looking rubber boot. Also, switching to something like a performance air filter can help out, and thankfully we actually carry performance air filters which suit the early production cars with the small nub, just like this BMC unit right here. So it's practical and performance oriented. More updates occurred in the engine bay, including the fuel pressure sensor. You'll notice this mounted just behind the intake plenum on the left side of the car, or the driver's side here in the United States. Some cars originally came with a fuel pressure sensor made by a company called Sensata. That since has been updated by Bosch, and when you buy a replacement fuel pressure sensor, you may notice or see that it comes with a thread adapter. That's to convert the threads that came with the Sensata equipped cars to the Bosch style. It's a very common thing. Not to fret if you have to do that. Speaking of the fuel system in this car, the E90 M3 features an interesting transfer pump situation where the fuel pump that actually sends fuel is also venturing from the other side. I don't know if venturing is a word, but it is now. The fuel injectors, which sit just to the outside of the throttle bodies, they last a very long time, but when they fail, they can fail in a pretty horrific way. There's been cases of fuel injectors sticking open and then causing a flooded engine, which then when cranked, if another cylinder lights off, it will effectively hydrolock and bend a connecting rod. So if you have a higher mileage car, I would say anywhere over 120,000 miles, I would probably do preventatively the fuel injectors if they've never been done before, just to make sure you never end up in that situation. Make sure when you install these that you use a little bit of silicone lube because you don't want to tear this O-ring. Another fuel system thing to know about is the fuel tank vent valve, or fuel system vent valve. When you're pulling fuel from a fuel tank, you're obviously creating a vacuum in the tank, and that pressure has to be equalized. Whether the engine is requesting something to do with the evap system, charcoal canister, or other tasks that the fuel system might need to do, it will be trying to do that with this fuel vent valve to equalize or control pressure relative to atmosphere and the tank. So if this fails, you may notice that your car will just die. Sometimes if you fill your car all the way up with fuel and there's not a lot of room for that air to compress and expand, you might notice the symptoms of a failing fuel vent valve a little bit more than normal. Thankfully, it's right under the intake plenum. It has an Oettinger clamp on one side and just a nipple on the other. So if you have a set of cutters, you can cut it off, replace it, throw another clamp in there, and it's pretty easy to maintain. Moving backwards from the fuel vent valve on the top of the engine, we have this giant guy, which is the secondary air pump hose, which routes air from the secondary air pump up to the front of the intake on the engine. If you're not familiar with what a secondary air pump does, it does the same job it does on any other car on the S65. If you've ever stoked a fire before or used one of those bellows things to make the fire hotter, that's effectively what a secondary air pump is doing at startup. It is allowing more air to enter the exhaust stream, and then therefore it is burning a leaner mixture, creating cleaner emissions, or so they say. This pipe, which connects to the secondary air pump, actually has its own MAF, just in case things needed to get any more complicated. And these MAFs can fail and cause some strange behavior. So just be sure if you're chasing a rough running situation and you think it might be the idle air control valve, or you're getting codes for something related to secondary air performance, make sure that this hose, which likes to stiffen up and crack over time, or this MAF are in good shape. And speaking of idle and rough running, this guy has been the source of a lot of people's troubles throughout the years. This is, of course, the idle air control valve. And you can think about it sort of like a ninth throttle body per se. So it has a little tiny butterfly valve on the inside, and it is basically a tiny throttle that bypasses those beautiful brass throttle bodies up top. This part, along with the Y, which connects it to both banks, can crack or fail. Obviously this doesn't crack, but that rubber boot will, allowing unmetered air to enter past the idle air control valve, which could cause rough running and overall an unstable driving experience. If you have any sort of unmetered air codes at idle or rough running, it could be down to this idle air control valve, and make sure you check that rubber Y to see if there's any cracks. Speaking of cracked rubber components, the S65 uses a set of rubber boots to basically adapt the what once was S85 throttle body to the front factory air plenum up top. NRW, a brand which we've recently brought on board, has started remaking a lot of these components in silicone rubber, which means they're going to last a long time and remain pliable under hot and cold cycles over longer periods of time. Something that doesn't go wrong that often on S65 equipped cars is the electric vacuum pump. This was a pretty modern thing for the time, and it's built quite robustly. However, the bearings inside will wear and over time can create noise. So if you hear a whirring noise when the car is doing anything in the backside of the engine bay, it is likely your vacuum pump. This can also cause limp mode as the crankcase loses some of its vacuum. Also, if you notice your brake pedal feels either very stiff or requires extra pumps or something like that, it could be because your vacuum pump is failing. So thankfully, they're pretty easy to get to. Check out your electric vacuum pump. If your S65 or E90 M3 is at about the 60 or 70,000 mile mark, it's a pretty high chance that your factory engine mounts are beat up. These factory mounts have been being produced since about 1670 when BMW made the first 3 Series. These are the same mounts that a whole bunch of cars use, E30s, E36s, E46s, and so thankfully they're very inexpensive. 034 Motorsport makes a different version of these mounts which visually looks the same, except it is filled with a different compound instead of these oil-filled ones like the factory, to give you a little bit more stiffness and a little bit more feel through the chassis. If you want to go even more extreme than that, you could swap these out for polyurethane mounts, but regardless, if you're at 60 or 70,000 miles, inspect these with a flashlight. If they're cracked, you can just put an engine bar in it, lift the engine up a little bit, or lift it by the oil pan since it's aluminum, and swap these out. It's not that hard. Moving on to combustion, the S65 uses a pretty unique system for knock detection. And while these coil packs can range anywhere from $1,500 to about $2,500 for a set, there's a little bit of good news in there, I promise. These coil packs are expensive because they use what's called ionic knock sensing. So a traditional engine will use the position of the crankshaft coupled with a set of microphones mounted to the engine called knock sensors to detect abnormal engine noise, pinging, fuel knock, etc. What the S65 does is it uses a similar principle to when you're standing next to a power line and you can hear a little bit of the electricity moving through the air. It basically sends a voltage in between every single power stroke across the spark plug strap, and it tries to detect how much resistance there is in the air in between the ground and the spark plug strap. By measuring this, it can determine how much fuel quantity there is in the air left unburnt, or how much oxygen there is, and based on, I would assume, many hours of testing at BMW, they can conclude if that has been a fuel knock event or not. Because of this crazy technology, not only is the MSS60 a very powerful factory ECU, but the factory knock sensors are quite expensive. Oftentimes though, when they fail, they'll only fail 1 or 2 at a time, and generally replacing 1 or 2 of them is totally fine, as they kind of have had unpredictable failure mileages throughout the years. So it's not really like a typical car where all 4 will go bad at once. You can usually just replace 1 and be fine for 10 or 20 or 30,000 more miles. And speaking of computers breaking stuff, we're going to move on to one of the more hot button items on the S65, which is these little guys. These are the throttle actuators, and we'll show you what they look like on the S65 itself. These sit in the valley of the motor, and they pull on 2 little rods, which then actuate the throttle arm, which then controls all the throttle bodies for a given bank. Now, these have a plastic gear sitting next to a bunch of motherboards and componentry. And what happens is, as the bearings and the gears inside break down, it coats that motherboard with bearing material, gear material, and all sorts of other debris. As soon as that debris builds up large enough to make a little bridge across a couple connections on the inside of that motherboard, you can experience erratic functionality. Limp mode is a very common cause of this. It won't do any sort of crazy, disastrous damage to your engine. You just might be stuck with limp home mode for a few miles. What can also happen on these is they will overheat, and a little black MOSFET will basically erupt. It'll shoot a little flame out or smoke out inside, and usually you can tell on the board where it's had that failure. I do want to talk about something that most people don't mention, which is I personally think the reason that these overheat and fail is due to the fact that the needle bearings, which the throttle rod rides on, are basically never maintained. There's no BMW maintenance lube for them. There's no BMW maintenance protocol for them. They are just needle bearings. They just exist, and eventually they wear out. It's important, if you want your throttle system to stay working well, to lube these needle bearings. And if you're not familiar with the term needle bearing, it's basically just a ball bearing, but instead of having balls that are suspending the center race, it actually has cylinders, and those cylinders are very small, so people refer to them as needle bearings. Taking a little bit of basically engine oil or just whatever oil you have to lubricate bearings, and go through and just push a little bit into those bearing seals, and then that way your needle bearings won't cause your throttle actuators to overheat. Thankfully, if you need to replace a set of these throttle actuators, while they can be a bit costly, it's a very easy job to do, as they're right in the valley of the engine. And that actually brings me on to my next point, which is if you're considering getting an E90 M3 or an S65 as a project car engine swap, rest assured that these engines are very, very easy to work on. And you might not believe me when I say that, but compared to, for example, the S55, which succeeded the S65, the packaging is really pretty easy. There isn't any like charge cooler or inlet pipe or turbo outlet running around the engine bay. It's pretty much just the plenum, which is very easy to remove. And then you have access to the entire valve of the engine, which you can access your fuel vent valve, your injectors, your spark plugs, your coil packs, your throttle actuators, your throttle bodies, valve covers, etc. So it's pretty easy to work on. So something in recent years that has become more and more of an issue on every single E90 M3, regardless of how well it's been taken care of, is the valve covers and valve cover gaskets. The factory valve covers are pretty trick. They're made of magnesium and they're painted. However, what's been happening more often than not is the paint on the magnesium valve covers flakes off. Now, a lot of people think this is bad because the coating is flaking into the rotating assembly of the engine. There's actually a side effect of the flaking coating, which is wherever that coating is placed underneath an O-ring or a sealing surface, such as the cam sensors on the motor, or most notably the oil-air separator mounted on top of the valve cover, that coating will flake off and stick to the O-ring. So while your O-ring might be sealing, the oil vapor is actually getting underneath the paint and coming up and going out of the engine. So if you have a factory valve cover in that light beige color or light gray color, and you see a little bit of oil mist accumulating on top of the valve cover, there's a very high chance that your oil-air separator, which is the small black thing mounted on top of the valve cover, or your cam sensor holes are starting to basically, the O-rings are contracting and the coating is flaking off, causing oil vapor to mist out of the valve cover. We offer a pretty awesome solution for this here at FC Puro, and in a whole host of different colors, which is the NRW aluminum valve cover set. It is a one-to-one reproduction of the factory valve covers, but it's made of cast aluminum. I've personally had mine hand polished, and I think they turned out pretty sweet. It also is a testament to how high quality the casting from NRW is, because it's not overly porous. It's a pretty well cast part. It honestly seems like it's die cast to me, which means that it's able to be polished, and there isn't going to be any sort of vapor seeping or oil seeping through the aluminum, which can happen on very thin aluminum parts. The valve cover gaskets are pretty easy to change, and while the valve cover bolts themselves are pretty pricey, there's a little bit of work you can do to save yourself a lot of headache in the future, which is these NRW silicone valve cover bolt gaskets. These are a reproduction of the original gaskets, which come with the factory valve cover bolts. The valve cover bolts have a captured washer in them, which is a pretty unique design, and every single one of them will include one of these grommets pre-installed. When you receive those bolts, you can simply take the rubber ones off, slip these NRW ones on, and you'll never have to worry about these getting hard over time ever again. If you've ever worked on an old E90 M3, when you remove those valve cover bolts, oftentimes the factory rubber grommets will actually stay compressed and they kind of look all pancaked out. And that's because the rubber has simply reached the end of its service life, whereas these silicone ones will spring back and last a lot longer. While you're in there and you have the valve cover off, you might want to do one of the most important maintenance items on the S65, which is replacing the factory plastic VANOS cam phaser caps with these metal ones. There's a couple different styles. Basically, the VANOS unit is a spring-loaded cam phaser which can adjust the position of the cam relative to the timing chain's position or the crank's position, and it has a coil spring on it. Now, this coil spring has a plastic cover to keep the spring from either having oil thrown at it or debris moving around inside the engine. These plastic covers, unfortunately, over time with extreme heat and a lot of wear, will crack, and the bits of oil, or sorry, the bits of plastic will actually end up in your oil pickup or in other parts of the engine. You don't want them. You can either replace them with these clip-on covers from Evolve like we have here, or there are other companies which make a bolt-on solution. Just be sure to check the torquing procedure for that bolt for the VANOS unit, because it is very complex and requires a lot of work. I also believe they are left-hand threads. So now that I've shown you some common failure points on this engine, we're going to dig in a little bit deeper, and I'm going to show you some things to look out for on the S65. Starting up top, if you ever get a limp mode and it's a throttle position related code, it's probably due to these guys. There is one per bank. This is a throttle position sensor. You'd think that the stepper motors down below would have their own position, and they do, but it's internal. The ECU checks that with a position sensor mounted at the end of each bank of ITBs. There's one here and one back there. They're pretty easy to swap out, but just be on the lookout for those codes. So looking at the top of the S65 V8 here, of course with the plenum removed, you can see these are the two throttle rods that control the movement of all of the butterflies. Now I can do this because there's no debris in here and I've cleaned it. If you are checking how smooth this is at home, make sure there's no debris. But what you want to do is make sure that these needle bearings, they're called needle bearings because they're just really tiny roller bearings, are moving freely. The throttle actuators have a lot of work to do if these seize up. When I first got this engine has 160,000 miles. When I first got it, I threw just a little bit of oil. You can really use whatever oil you feel comfortable with in there, and that just keeps this moving freely. And you can see it actuating all of the butterflies, which is totally glorious. If you want to learn more about what's in the valley of these motors and replacing the throttle actuators, you can check out our DIY, which Gareth did on his own car behind me, and that'll teach you how easy it is to replace these throttle actuators. It's really not that bad. So I'm going to pull apart the top of the valve cover here and show you what I mean by those plastic VANOS covers, as well as showing you what can fail on the factory valve covers to cause oil leaks, rough running, or oil mist accumulating on the top of your motor. Mounted on your valve cover are, of course, all the very expensive coil packs, and there's this little guy right here, which is known as your air oil separator. What this does is it takes the oil vapors from inside of the engine and it moves them up to the air intake so that can be re-ingested and not just released into the atmosphere. So we're going to pop this valve cover off, and I'll show you another choice upgrade we have from NRW, as well as how the baffling system works on the S65 valve covers that enters this oil air separator. Now I should mention before we pull this valve cover gasket and valve cover off that there's actually another gasket up here. It's called the timing cover gasket. This is the timing cover right at the front. It basically allows access to the entire cam sprocket, and there's a little steel gasket on the underside of here. If you're replacing your VANOS covers, the plastic ones, with a metal option, it's a good idea to replace those as well, and they're included in our VANOS sprocket cover kit. So as we're pulling apart the top of the engine here, there's a few little gaskets that you want to look out for. When you're servicing your valve cover gasket, it's always a great idea on these cars to replace the O-rings on both the cam sensors as well as the air oil separator. When I took my original ones out at 160,000 miles, they were squared right off, which means there's actually a small vacuum leak happening. The S65 has a whole bunch of little tiny tangs on the valve cover to hold the wiring loom in place, which is really nice. They just basically slot in on these little grooves, which makes doing things like a coil pack replacement or a spark plug change just a little bit less tedious. These coil packs, if you're removing them, make sure to twist and pull because the tops of them have been known to break off. BMW actually has a special tool which has like a little tripod thing which pushes against the valve cover and puts even pressure on the tops of these. You can usually get them out by hand, but just make sure that you twist them first or else you might break off the top of these. So with our valve cover removed, you can see another choice upgrade we've done here. These are the NRW aluminum spark plug tubes. These are billet aluminum as opposed to the plastic ones from the factory. I believe they're actually a similar price to the OEM ones as well. And these, of course, will never break down or crack. The O-rings are also really high quality, so they're not going to fail and get flat like the factory ones. Here you can see NRW's reproduction of the factory baffling. This is where the oil air separator inlets are, and thankfully you should never have to touch those, but like I said, good idea to upgrade your spark plug tubes when you're doing a valve cover gasket. Now that we're in here, I can show you that I have a bunch of varnish. This is what happens to S65s when you don't do regular oil changes. Garrett's engine, which has about 50,000 miles, he's done oil changes, I think once every 5,000 miles, and his engine is spotless. Mine, someone clearly, I don't even want to know what they pushed it to, but they were pushing it hard enough where this gunk starts to accumulate on the camshafts, in the corners of the valve cover, and some of that is also thanks to the factory valve cover flaking off. But this is the inside of the top end of an S65. With the valve cover off, I can show you the very cool cam gears. However, these are the not so cool plastic VANOS spring caps. Basically, there is a clock style spring in here which is retained by this plastic cap. Now, thankfully, since the timing cover bolts are right here, you can pop this timing cover off, remove the plastic covers, and clip on these metal ones, replace the gasket, replace the timing cover. However, if you wanted to replace these with a captured through bolt style cover, you're going to have to pull out these cam bolts, and there's a very, very lengthy tightening procedure for them. I'd recommend you just stick with the clip-on ones, especially from a reputable company like Evolve at fcpro.com. Now, BMW doesn't really want you to know this, but there is a bit of a cheat code on the front of these engines. If you're trying to replace your idler pulleys, which if you hear one squealing, probably a good time to do so, BMW wants you to replace the bearing, the pulley, and the tensioner arm all at once. They want you to replace everything. Now, that's a couple $100 per side, per belt. What you can do instead is the pulley part numbers are actually listed just under this cap right on the pulley itself, and you can just replace the pulley. Whether you have a pre or post May 15th of 2008 production date car, that will be a different pulley number. Some are larger and some are smaller. However, it is still possible to replace just the pulley regardless of what production date you have. There's also this guy up here, which can be replaced separately, and they're all on fcpro.com. So if you want to save yourself about $400 on the front end of the motor on the accessories, just replacing the pulleys is a great idea. Also here at the front of the motor, we have the oil filter housing, the oil filter housing cap, which in this case has been upgraded to an aluminum unit from Future Classic I&D. And of course the oil filter housing itself. This oil filter housing gasket doesn't degrade as fast as it does on other BMW motors, especially the modern turbo ones, because this really doesn't get that heat soaked up here. However, it will need replacing at about 120 or 130,000 miles. It's a little bit more complex to get to. Obviously, the oil lines in the front have to come off. The accessories are kind of in the way. But if you're going to have anything done by a shop, this would be a good thing, so you don't have to worry about it ever again. And finally, the big one, well actually two big ones, three big ones? The S65's Achilles heel, which really isn't its Achilles heel, it's simply a idiosyncrasy of the engine. We've all seen the jokes about rod bearings, we've all seen the basic maintenance memes, but realistically, doing this job isn't that difficult. And there's actually a few things that haven't been discussed over the last couple of years that are starting to pop up that we want to talk about here. FCPro sells a complete rod bearing replacement kit. Now what's on the table here is actually a little bit misleading because we don't include oil. You get to choose that yourself, and this is for something I'm going to talk about later. The actual kit, which has been very, very hand-picked, is full of every one-time use bolt, steering coupler bolts with Loctite, subframe bolts, subframe nuts, everything you could imagine, including the oil pan gasket and the oil pan bolts. It's everything you could need to replace while you're doing your E92 or E9X M3 rod bearing service. I personally had never done anything on the inside of an engine other than a valve lash adjustment and a head gasket once, and I tackled the rod bearing replacement myself while the engine was on an engine crane from Harbor Freight, and it was no big deal. I did it in an evening. Just take your time. It's really not that hard. Just remember, a lot of people are in way worse circumstances replacing rod bearings on their engine, and it's really no different. Where the engine differentiates itself from normal engines, however, is the main bearings. In recent years, after people have done rod bearing services on their higher mileage S65s, main bearings have started to crop up as an issue. It turns out that the aluminum block with the steel inserts for bearings was an issue for both the main bearings and the rod bearings. The clearances are simply too tight. So main bearings should be also replaced. However, if you're going to do this, unlike a traditional engine where it has a set of main bearing caps which pull off, the S65 actually has an aluminum bed plate construction. This means that the bottom half of the block in between just about the center line of the crankshaft and the oil pan is a separate chunk of aluminum, and it's all one piece. Now, there's an absolutely amazing video done by M539 Restorations. Sretton, if you're watching this, I'm a huge fan of yours. And he pretty much did the world a favor doing a complete soup to nuts engine rebuild, and he shows you how to rebuild and replace the main bearings in that video effectively. I did want to note, however, that if you're doing that service, the S65 is again unique in that the bed plate doesn't actually have a gasket. It has a high pressure sealant which is injected from the side of the block using a small tool. Now, we actually sell the primer for this here at FC Puro, as well as the sealant and the tool to inject it. The primer comes in a little bottle like this, and then the sealant itself is in this tube, which is sort of like a miniature caulk tube. And then you use something like this CT8 3801 to compress that tube and shoot the sealant out into this guy, which is a tiny little nozzle with a little ball, a check ball in it, and that is what traps the sealant in between the bed plate and the block. If you do the main bearings and the rod bearings, you have an engine that is pretty much going to be good for the rest of the lifetime of your ownership of the car. Now, if you're looking to do something a little bit more intense than just replacing with factory rod bearings, there's plenty of options out there. I don't necessarily know if I'm supposed to say this, but I personally went with calico coated bearings from VAC along with ARP rod bearing bolts, connecting rod bolts. They're a little bit easier to work with than the factory bolts. They also have a slightly easier torque procedure than the factory bolts, but again, it's all pretty reasonable to do. If you have an engine crane or you have a good way to get your car off the ground, such as a quick jacks, you can do it in your garage probably in about a weekend. So with that, I think we've covered basically everything there is to know about the S65 V8 from BMW. If you're looking at buying one, trust me, a lot of these maintenance items, while they sound expensive and scary, they're few and far between compared to some of the modern engines out there. And the S65 is actually built pretty stout and has a lot of old school tricks up its sleeve to be easy to work on and long lasting at high RPM. Thank you so much for watching this video. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to both our main channel and our DIY channel, and we'll see you next time.